Life is an absolute struggle. Just think back to the time that you were a sperm cell fighting to get into your mother's womb. Or try to think back to the time you were basically pushing yourself out of your mother's vagina while being born. And then having everybody look at your mediocre junk and your naked body. You have all these nurses already basically body shaming you. You're there coming out of your mom's hairy vagina with liquid seeping everywhere. You're gasping for your first breath of air. And then on top of that, there are times when the doctor has to spank your naked ass. And there are those few moments where parents feel where it's important to record all of this. Not only do you live a very traumatizing moment in your life, but you can now relive it. But anyways, all of this just goes to drive my point home that life is an absolute struggle. Life is difficult. There is no bringing the difficulty down in real life. And you have to deal with some pretty ridiculous, stupid NPCs on a daily basis. And all of that ties into what our top 5 list is today. We're going to be looking at the top 5 most difficult video games of all time. I don't know if you can legitimately call yourself a gamer if you haven't played at least one of the video games on this particular list. As is always the case before I start these videos, I let you guys know up front, this is a subjective list. It's a matter of personal opinion. It's a matter of perspective. Let me know in the comment section what particular game you guys felt like deserved the top spot, or maybe a specific video game that I missed that I didn't put in the list. Let me know in the comment section. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Sit back, kick the J's off. Let's get straight into today's list with number 5. And this is probably the only modern game that really plays off as a retro style game and brought back everything that was creepy about, you know, the era of like the early 1900s, 1930s to 1940s. Studio MDHR really knew exactly what they were doing. They were able to kind of make us feel nostalgic for an era that none of us truly experienced. I doubt anybody watching this video is old enough to remember that era, but for some reason we kind of resonate with it. If you've watched old Cat the Felix animated series or anything that's related to like the Looney Tunes, you'll be very familiar with that style. The storyline is also incredibly dark and sinister. You basically go around doing the devil's work after losing a game at his casino, and as expected, you're eventually able to defeat the devil himself. However, before that, you will get destroyed, you will get pummeled, you will rip out your eyebrows in anger. The game forces you to kind of learn the patterns and use perfect timing to be able to defeat especially a lot of the bosses or a lot of the later bosses. It's really difficult to compare it to any particular game, although the one that kind of came to my mind after playing it a few times is probably Galaga, like a modernized version of Galaga. At least that's how it played off to me. At the end of every single level, there is a very rewarding feeling as you upgrade your character, but as I mentioned before, it is definitely not a forgiving game, and you can unlock even more difficult playing levels the more that you progress through the game. But be forewarned, this is definitely not a game for the faint of heart or those that easily rage quit. For number 4, we have Bloodborne, which was released in 2015, and it received quite a bit of praise upon its release. It had a phenomenal gothic atmosphere to it. It's a role-playing game which basically explores a city where a bloodborne illness has basically taken over and created creatures out of all of the citizens there. And even though the game really does stand on its own 2 feet, it's very unique, but a lot of critics and fans alike really love to compare it to the Dark Souls franchise. And even though there is definitely some truth to that comparison, I do feel like the video game is a little bit more fast-paced. It requires better timing, and even though the game did receive, as I mentioned before, almost near perfect reviews, there were some issues which added actually to the difficulty of the game. I think some of the shoddy camera work in certain levels when it came down to the melee and combat systems really made it even much more difficult than it probably should have been. The video game would go on to win a plethora of different Game of the Year awards. It was also nominated for quite a few Game of the Year awards, such as Game of the Year and Best Role-Playing Game as well. So if you really want to play a game that will make you rip your chest hairs out, this would be the perfect candidate for you. Next up on the list, we have Nioh, which was a game developed by Team Ninja and was eventually released way back in 2017. This video game had a very tumultuous beginning. It almost took a grand total of 10 years for it to actually come to fruition. A lot of it had to do with some behind the scenes issues going on. Just to illustrate how many problems this video game went through, this was originally set to be released for the PlayStation 3, and it actually had to be postponed all the way up until PlayStation 4 was released. The game's story itself wasn't very intriguing, and that was probably one of the bigger downsides for this particular game, but where it really was able to shine and truly showcase how good of a game it was when you actually got immersed in the combat system. And it sort of has a theme so far in this list. Yes, it's kind of very somewhat slow-paced game compared to what we're used to. If you're a hardcore gamer, it's very slow-paced, and it relies a lot on your timing for you to be able to defeat a lot of these enemies. But where it really shines is the fact that you have to really be able to calculate how much of your stamina you use in this particular game. Every dodge, every single action is going to lower your stamina, so it's very important for you to do the math and figure out how exactly you're going to defeat every single enemy, and make sure that you have enough stamina to be able to dodge and block and attack. Ultimately, the gameplay or the combat system doesn't really have a blueprint. Every single enemy will require a different set of combinations or a different stance to be able to defeat him. And as I mentioned before, even though that's what makes the video game extremely complicated and difficult, I feel like that's what really makes the video game worth playing. Even though the video game was critically very well received, it didn't win as many, or it was nominated for as many games as some of the other games on this list. It was nominated for Best Action Video Game in the Game Awards from 2017. But as I mentioned before, the fact that it wasn't nominated or it didn't win as many awards as some of the other games on this list, that shouldn't really make you shy away from this game. I think a lot of it has just to do with the fatigue that was going on at the time. We had received multiple different iterations of this style of gameplay, and even though it was near a perfect game aside from the storyline and some of the quests, I still feel like it was just a massively underappreciated game at the time of its release. Our second spot on the list is actually going to go to probably the oldest game on the list, and we're talking about Contra, which was released all the way back in 1987, and it was released on the NES. This video game had absolutely no business being this difficult, seeing as how at the time that the NES was released, most of them were being played by young adults or children. None of the games were really geared towards adults at the time, and the whole idea of adult gamers existing, I think that's a trend that started a few years after the release of this video game. And this is definitely not a game that you run into blindly. It is a very difficult, complex game that requires a little bit of planning and at least a little bit of experience handling the game. It's not like just because you're a seasoned veteran in the gaming industry, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can just pick up the controller and just dominate the video game. It really forces you to have experience with the style. It's a relentless, fast-paced action video game, and I think it was definitely ahead of its time. A lot of video games that eventually preceded it did use a lot of the formulas that Contra became extremely famous for. Even though there are a plethora of different ports out there that you can actually play the franchise on, we recently got the SNES Mini Classic, which you could actually play Contra number 3 on. And I feel as time goes by, the more, some of the arcade machines, for example, the 1UP arcade machine, which seems to have also gotten the license to be able to publish a Contra arcade cabinet. I think the more people get exposed to this video game, I think the more people will appreciate truly how good of a video game this actually was, especially for the time frame that it was released at. As if there was any doubt what the number one spot was going to belong to, we're going to be talking about Dark Souls, which was a role-playing video game that was released in 2011 by Bandai Namco, which led to 2 fantastic sequels in Dark Souls number 2 and number 3, which were released in 2014 and 2017 respectively. The game received overwhelmingly good reviews overall, and it was hailed for its fantastically complex combat system. As was the case with Neo, Dark Souls made you heavily rely on your stamina and your wise use of it, making you calculate every single move that you made. The combat system wasn't as fast-paced as hardcore gamers are used to. It was a little bit sluggish, but that ultimately made the video game that much more difficult. Everything was more methodical. It wasn't as simple as other games that were being released along the same time frame. The game forced you to have some sort of game plan to attack each and every single boss. The subsequent sequels actually went on to be critically very well received as well, and Dark Souls number 3 actually went on to break some record sales in terms of how many copies were being sold worldwide. The video game eventually went on to win quite a few awards and has been considered the greatest video game of all time by different entities within the gaming community. But that is our list. In this YouTuber's humble opinion, this is the most difficult video game of all time. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think of this list. Do you guys agree? Do you disagree? What video games did I not have on the list that you feel should have been? Let me know in the comment section, guys. Stay safe out there. Have a good holiday, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you.